Welcome, everyone, to another expert-led large group supervision session here at Resilient Mind Psychotherapy. Our guest today is Matthieu Villatte, a psychology author, trainer, and coach. He earned his doctoral degree in psychology in France, where he was trained as a clinical psychologist. In 2010, he moved to the United States to complete a post-doctoral fellowship at the University of Nevada, Reno, under the mentorship of Stephen Hayes, who is the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy. Following this, he worked as an assistant professor and a researcher at the University of Louisiana, the Evidence-Based Practice Institute of Seattle, and Bastyr University. Matthieu is the author of numerous books and book chapters on mindfulness, acceptance, and experiential therapies, as well as contextual behavioral science. His work includes the first acceptance and commitment therapy manual published in French, as well as Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention, co-authored with Jennifer Villatte and Stephen Hayes. He is also a peer-reviewed trainer in acceptance and commitment therapy, recognized by the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, and has facilitated hundreds of clinical trainings around the world. Matthieu, welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, metaphorically, the floor, right? We don't meet in person anymore nowadays. But I'm still grateful for meeting people all over the world. It's a nice platform. I'm going to travel for the first time in a very long time next month to Mexico. But besides that, I haven't done a training in person in 6 or 7 years, partly because of COVID and because things tend to move online. But it's, very nice to meet you and to be with you on this Sunday morning. I heard it's very cold in New York. A lot of people are in this area. It's pretty cold here, not as bad, but happy to meet with you.
So I guess we can start with, maybe you can kind of just explain what relational frame theory is, kind of how what your work revolves, how it relates to ACT. And
So in a nutshell, relational frame theory, but it's a theory of language that comes from the tradition of behavioral psychology, or in the sort of I don't want to say new version because it feels a bit arrogant to say it this way, but there's a branch of behavioral psychology became contextual behavioral science. Long story short, we could say that Stephen Hayes and his colleagues and students back in the 2000s, 2010, at some point they decided that they were a bit tired of trying to explain what RFT is to their colleagues from behavior analysis. So they sort of developed their own group, society, association. It often happens like that in groups. And so there's a whole philosophy called functional contextualism, a science called contextual behavioral science. For some people in behavioral psychology, they could look at it and say, well, it's just behavioral psychology. And I could be one of those people because I was not trained originally in the Steve's lab or in this group, contextual behavioral science. I come from a behavioral psychology training in France. And relational frame theory is we could say the branch of contextual behavioral science that is interested in language and cognition. So in the tradition of behavioral psychology, we approach pretty much everything as behaviors, and it's true also of language. Language is a behavior. It might seem not a big of a deal, okay, behavior, but it makes a big difference when you look at it from the context of behavioral psychology, because then it means we're interested in what shapes the behavior, how you learn a behavior, how it works functionally. It gives a status to language that is really critical. So we approach it as the behavior of, basically, I'm going to say it in a very plain language, as I like to do it in trainings often. It's the ability of making connections, basically, connecting things symbolically. It can be used for communication, like I'm doing right now. I'm using sounds that mean something, symbols, right? I'm using words. I have to choose words that we can all understand here. It's not even my first language, but I'm choosing the sounds that are going to create a meaning to you. So it's communication, but it's also about transformation of what we call transformation of function in RFT. So a way it changes the way we perceive things. So typical examples we give in ACT is how thoughts can change our perceptions of our, say, for example, physical sensations. In my heart start to beat fast just as I'm speaking now. Does that mean I'm anxious? Does that mean I'm having the imposter syndrome or public speaking anxiety? Or does that mean I'm very excited because it's cool to be with people and talk about RFT? Or but maybe I'm having some health issues. So there's a whole interpretation process here. That means that the connections that we build can also change the way we respond to our experiences. If I think that I'm having a panic attack, I'm not going to respond the same way as if I think I'm very excited. That's cool. I'm alive. My heart is beating fast. That's so nice to be alive. So RFT is interested in this whole process, basically. How we develop language, how we language changes our responses to our experiences. And the connection with ACT, well, originally, it is hard to make to define the clear connection between ACT and RFT if you look historically, because they co-developed. That's the official story, or the more accurate story. Sometimes it's presented as this way. ACT is based on RFT. ACT developed, there's RFT lab research, and then we developed ACT. It didn't really happen that way. It's more like there is RFT, there is ACT, and there is an interconnection of both. One being more like the basic science in labs, interested in how language develops, and then ACT, the clinical model. That's an interconnection is especially around this idea that language can cause problems or is involved in psychological issues. It's something that we have to understand in the context of the development of the third wave of CBT in the 90s. It really exploded at the end of the 90s. Where basically, instead of thinking that thoughts were causing problems, we were thinking more in terms of how we respond to our thoughts. So there's a recognition, as in cognitive therapy, that thoughts can have an influence on the way we behave. Right? There's the whole idea of how we interpret things. It can change the way we respond to things. I was just saying, like if I think I'm stupid, if I think I'm not enough, if I think I'm a loser, and I respond based on that, or if I think that life is meaningless, it can influence the way I respond to my life, right? Like I thought, what's the point of waking up this morning and talking to you? Who cares? Maybe I would not get up, or I would come, but I would not be very motivated. So with ACT and the whole third wave approach, the idea is to notice those thoughts and start to respond differently to it. So that's in a nutshell. I will probably develop more, but the connection between ACT and RFT is the recognition that language plays a critical role in psychological issues. And then what's I think interesting for our discussion today, more specifically related to the book we wrote 10 years ago, that originally the ACT techniques processes were more derived from this RFT rational, but not really based on RFT. So you in fact, if you went to trainings in ACT or read ACT books back in the 2000s, you would usually read a chapter on RFT that explains what language is from a behavioral perspective and how language can lead to problems. So you're fused with your thoughts, that leads to avoidance, but you cannot avoid it because thoughts always come back. And then next chapter, you start to get into, okay, what can we do? And then mindfulness and values and diffusion. But at that point, you would not really hear about RFT anymore. So it's not like RFT, Relational Frame Theory, would guide your clinical work. It was more like the rationale to justify ACT. And that's even the way I taught my first trainings when I started to train acts back in France at the end of the 2000s, early 2010. But having done my own PhD dissertation on RFT, I always thought that there was more to it, or we could do more, And at some point, I got really interested in linking ACT to RFT more clearly, and especially to be able to use RFT principles, because after all, it's a theory of language, and language is arguably the main tool we use in psychotherapy. Always interacting with clients, even in the silence, there's a lot of meaning. Even in an experiential exercise that consists of just noticing your physical sensations, there are going to be instructions. There are going to be a lot of thoughts of labeling your experiences. So language is always part of the process, at the core of the process. And so if we have a functional theory of language, and language is a main tool of therapy, we should do something with it, right? And so that's how we ended up exploring how we could use more explicitly RFT for clinical practice, not just to explain the rationale that leads to ACT, but then to guide the psychotherapy work. And that's how we ended up writing this book and then developing this approach, which I'll finish with this. We could consider it's a sort of RFT-based ACT, or more explicitly RFT-based ACT. ACT is defined in ways that are very, very flexible. So I don't necessarily see it as something fundamentally different. But what I would say is that when you know RFT well, you tend to see ACT more as a way of doing RFT. You start to look at a lot of psychotherapy approaches and recognize that they have something that may be a bit different than ACT, but that is also consistent with RFT.
Yeah, you think it's accurate to say that RFT is like a broader thing? It's broader, and ACT is like kind of a more focused?
Yeah, definitely. Although, of course, it depends on how you conceptualize ACT. If you conceptualize ACT as applied RFT, then of course it's not it would still be broader, because RFT is not a therapy, it's not the application, when you have a model of research, yeah, exactly, then you can apply it to education, to coaching, to communication, marketing, if you want, if you're into that, to pretty much anything that touches on language, and ACT would be just the clinical application in that case. Yeah.
Great. So can we get into some of the principles, some of like the essential principles of RFT? I know that there's some clinicians that are trained in ACT, and maybe some are new, but just understanding kind of the foundations of RFT would be really helpful.
Yeah. Well, so we built a framework, so that's RFT principles. If you explore RFT, if you look at some papers, scientific papers, or books for scholars, you realize, wow, it's really complex, and there are lots of terms and jargon, and it's hard to see what you could do with it from the basic research, and that's why it was probably put aside in terms of application or direct application, because it for scholars, researchers, yeah, it's great, but it's a bit like, if you look at a language of programmation and you don't know anything about programmation, it's just like, what is that? Just give me the application, the app on my phone, because I cannot do anything with it. Except if you know the language of programmation, then you can do a lot with it. So it's kind of like that. And in order to make it practical, you still have to transform those principles so that it's handy, it's practical. Even for me, who knows RFT well and has been in the dealing with these principles for more than 20 years now, when I am in with a client, I can go back and forth at different levels of analysis, but mostly I'm thinking at a level that's a little more in between the common language, everyday language, and the very, very, very basic principle. So the way we organize our framework, and there are different ways you could organize RFT. There are different approaches to applying RFT out there, and they're all very, I think they're all very consistent with each other. They're all very consistent with RFT, but it's a bit like an ACT. I don't know what you know, guys, in the group in terms of the ACT models, but there are different forms of ACT. Something that is called the matrix, for example. Then the more common one is the hexaflex, because there are 6 processes in it. Then there is something called the DNA-V model. They are models. They're like metaphors to express the same principles. So what we built, and so to answer your question more directly now, is a framework organized around 2 main processes. One is context sensitivity, or flexible context sensitivity. Basically, it's the ability of noticing the various elements of your experience. It has a lot to do with the awareness, mindfulness, if you want. Like right now, what is context sensitivity for me? It's being able to notice people on the screen here, but I can also notice what I'm seeing through the window if I want to. It's part of the context. No, arguably, it's not very relevant right now. It's not really that important. Most important is what's on the screen. So that's the idea with flexibility. I can be aware of a lot of things in my experience, but I'm also able to respond to what's most relevant. If I'm very hungry right now, should I respond to that or not? Well, it depends. If I'm very hungry, I'm about to crash. Maybe I say, you know what, let me just grab something because I don't know what, but why? But I am very hungry. But if I'm just a bit hungry, I can just let that go and say, hey, an hour or something, I will eat something. But I'm still aware of it. So I'm sensitive to it, but not to the point of responding to it. So that's context sensitivity. And then the other process is functional coherence. What is functional coherence? It's the ability of conceptualizing my experience in a way that's holistic and pragmatic. So I'm always moving toward an integration of everything in my experience. See, I don't have to avoid my sensation of hunger. I can say, yeah, it's part of my sensation now. I don't have to reject it. I don't have to say it's not there. It can be there, just like the weather outside. It's not relevant to our discussion right now, except if I use it as an example. But it can be there. I don't have to exclude it. It's there. So it's always moving toward an integration of everything. So you can recognize the connection probably with acceptance, self-as context in ACT, if you're familiar with that. It's a very integrative approach where we don't try to eliminate, select what is good or bad as an experience, but instead always move toward an inclusion of everything. And I was saying pragmatic. So functional coherence is holistic and pragmatic. Pragmatic has to do with thinking functionally, thinking in terms of utility. As I was saying earlier, the shift from the second wave to the third wave of CBT, you could say that it came from, is my thoughts true, to is my thoughts useful? Right? Or how do I respond to these thoughts? A thought could be true, but not useful in the sense of I should act based on that right now. I often used to say in ACT trainings, find an example of thoughts that is fundamentally, intrinsically not true at all. I don't think I can find one. I think it always depends on context. To some extent, you could make the case that, well, it depends on how you look at things. That's what we do with language. We can always, like people who do improvisation, they're very good at it. You can throw anything to them and they will make a story with it, or they will find a way to integrate it. So there is that dimension of integration, the holistic stance, but also it has to be useful. So what is useful? Well, it's useful in a holistic way. You see how it connects? It's sort of circular, but in a good way, not in an empty way, in a very reflexive way. How do I know that my way of thinking is useful? Because it takes everything into account. And when I take everything into account, what seems to make sense is me right now speaking to you in front of this computer. There are a lot of other things I could be doing right now. There are a lot of things to attend to in my context. If I'm sensitive to all contexts, there are a lot of things. Just like for you, there are a lot of things you could be doing or thinking of. But if I consider my whole experience, the time, my history, what I care about, how I'm feeling, and it seems, it's not like I have an absolute knowledge of what's true or not true. It's very dynamic. Right now, it seems like it makes sense to me to be here right now, but anything could happen. Maybe there's a big bang in the building, and I say, you know what? Sorry, I have to leave. That's what's most relevant now. Or I'm very sick. I should stop here. It's always based on that openness to the transformation in the context. So again, to summarize, it's basically I'm aware of the whole context, and I'm able to integrate everything and think in terms of what's useful in it. So in ACT, we talk about values, committed actions, right? We try to help clients move toward actions that are connected to their values instead of just goals, outcomes in terms of what's right, wrong in an absolute way, or true, not true in a fundamental way. It's always like sort of dynamic reflection on the whole self, on the whole experience.
Yeah, beautiful. So you mentioned context flexibility, which is and functional coherence. Those are so
context sensitivity, or you get the whole name. It would be flexible context sensitivity, but really context sensitivity is the short term.
Yeah. So context flexibility is basically being aware of what's happening in where you are and different things that could be happening, and then functional coherence is kind of the reframe from is this thought true, or is this useful, or is it's kind of, I guess it's aligned with like pragmatism, right? It
really is pragmatism, but pragmatism I think that pragmatism is often misunderstood, except if you studied philosophy, because there's an American school of philosophy called pragmatism that is often understood as just utilitarian. It's pragmatic means that I'm doing what works. And actually, I think it's often understood this way in ACT, and that's a problem because it becomes too mechanistic, too limited to goals and outcomes, which is a shame because that's really not what ACT was about originally. But I think it tends to go in that direction when we think like, okay, how can I help my clients move to the right behaviors? Like this depressed client who is not getting up in the morning and not meeting friends and all. Okay, so how can we help them move toward what works, what doesn't work? That's very pragmatic. Let's let go of thoughts that I'm not enough, that life is meaningless, and instead focus on what works. The problem is what works is defined how based on what criteria. You should get up because that's what a good person does. You should go to work. You should produce wealth. You could argue that no, that's not what I should do. Maybe actually I should stay in bed and wait until life makes sense. It's not necessarily so absurd. Pragmatism, in my understanding of pragmatism, it's holistic. It has to be holistic. It's always like considering the whole. That's why it's very spiritual. And that part is important in ACT. It was at the origin of ACT. Steve Hayes often says that the first ACT RFT paper is his paper from 1984 called The Making Sense of Spirituality, which is a really interesting paper where basically he makes the case that we can study spirituality from a behavioral perspective. It's not about discussing the existence of God. It's about looking at what people do as a behavior when they're being spiritual. And so, of course, it can be relevant to behavioral psychology because any behavior is relevant. And so then he tries to make a case for spirituality being a behavior of basically a reflection on your own behavior. And I would add an integrative stance, an integrative perspective on your whole self. So that's, to me, that in the end, yes, it is pragmatism. Pragmatism is not just utilitarian. I do what works, because honestly, that could lead you to being more a sociopath than humanistic human being. The point is not to promote just flexibility. I'll do what works. I do whatever works for me. No, it's like I do what works, but by what works, I mean all things considered. When I consider my whole self, and by my whole self, I mean also my experience of other people of the world. Like, should I lie, for example? It depends on the context. There are contexts where it might be the right thing to do. You're assaulted by someone who wants to know where you live to steal your money there. Maybe actually it is the right thing to do, to tell them the truth. I don't know. It depends on the context again. But it's you cannot just say, well, it works to reach that particular goal. To me, it's very important to consider the transcendent dimension of pragmatism. And that's something you find in surface context. That's something you find in values. There are really transcendent forces really in act.
Yeah, beautiful. It's like, it's not about whether God exists, but it's like if a person is praying, what is that, what kind of behaviors, how does that change their life and things? So it makes it very pragmatic about the actual behavior rather than, whether something is true or not.
Yeah. From an act RFT perspective, you could consider the person who is meditating is more spiritual than a person who's praying if the person who's praying is praying in a dogmatic way. I'm not religious, so I refrain from being judgmental. Well, in general, probably a good idea, but especially judgmental about people who might be religious in a rigid way. But I'm looking at it from a psychological perspective. And for me, from a psychological perspective, flexibility, integration is always a good thing. Now, whether it's about believing in God or believing in science, because honestly, I think there are people who believe in science in ways that are much more dogmatic than people who are religious nowadays. It's a form of religion. If you believe in it, in a very righteous way, the experts say this and that. It's not really different than saying the same thing about God or a philosopher or something like that. From a psychological perspective, again, if it was from a religious perspective, maybe I would say something different. But from a psychological perspective, I'm interested in the ability of people to be context sensitive and functionally coherent. So it can be about anything. I work with clients who are religious. It's no incompatibility because, in fact, sometimes I even find myself that when they're questioning their faith in God, sometimes I'm actually kind of on the side of God, so to speak, because from a psychological perspective, I think it is defendable. It's all about the rigidity or the flexibility that you have. And I know people who are religious who approach it this way too. They say, for example, you should question the existence of God. That's healthy. If it continues to be true, if your questioning leads you to believe in God, then that's what faith is about. It's even stronger. There's nothing wrong with asking yourself questions. There's nothing wrong with reading religious writings and wondering what it means to you. In fact, it is the process. But again, it's a matter of perspective. There are approaches that are more strict, maybe more literal, just like there are literal and functional ways of interpreting the Constitution. We know that it's always a dynamic among experts. Should we take literally what was written in the Constitution, or should we interpret it based on what's useful today? You see, this dynamic is at the core of ACT and RFT when we say how we relate to our thoughts. Am I not enough? Well, maybe it's not a bad idea to consider these thoughts. Maybe I'm not well prepared for this work. Maybe I should get a degree before doing this job. So maybe the not good enough is a good thing to consider. But if I take it literally, there's really not much room for interpretation and adaptation. So we're always looking for something that is more dynamic, flexible, but also very coherent. It's not flexibility, wishy-washy or unstable. It's flexibility that paradoxically perhaps brings you a lot of stability. Just like maybe questioning the existence of God actually strengthen your faith because it's the process.
Nice. So, there's obviously a lot to understanding RFT and just how language works in general. What are, maybe some like very practical aspects of it that clinicians here, that maybe haven't taken a long course, but they could already start applying and potentially using with their clients?
Yeah, so I would say, in ACT, you're often going to find a lot of techniques. When you start learning ACT, if you go to a training, you learn what acceptance is, doing an exercise where you're invited to think of something that's painful and then change your attitude toward it and notice what difference it makes. Or you learn a metaphor that explains and also kind of changes your experience of struggling with emotions. And often therapists, when they start learning ACT, they will often bring those exercises to their practice because it's relatively easy to reproduce. Now, the problem is it's often limited because the benefits of formal exercises is that they're relatively standard, and if they've been well tested, you can think that, okay, it should work on most people. But in psychology, it's much more dynamic than that. If your client knows that you're using an exercise because you want them to diffuse, then you can use any diffusion exercise and they might rebel against it. I know what you're doing. If you have a partner who with whom you've had sometimes difficult conversations, and you said something like, no, I understand where you're coming from, and they said, well, don't do your therapist thing on me. And yet it's not a bad thing, right? I understand where you're coming from, but it's not so much what you say as much as the spirit, I guess, with which you're saying it. And I think the benefit of knowing RFT is that it helps you get more at the core of the function of what you're doing. You don't really have to rely on techniques so much. It's a very strange thing, but I've noticed that therapists, the more they know RFT, and the less technical they become. It's like their practice looks more and more like a natural conversation. For me personally, over the past few years, I've been really influenced and inspired by Carl Rogers, for example, a lot, which is interesting because he's not at all a behavioral therapist. In fact, he was more relatively opposed to behavioral therapy, if I understand well, because I think he was seeing it as too mechanistic. And it's interesting because when I look at his videos now, I see that is exactly how I want to do clinical RFT, and I think it's because you're able to recognize the functions of what you do, no matter what you're saying. You don't have to rely on specific words or specific techniques. You see the function of your intervention through a varieties of techniques, words, what you're saying. You recognize the silence can have as much meaning as a long speech about acceptance. So to answer your question, it's difficult because if I give you any example, I could say, well, but that's really not about that specifically. If we're talking about RFT, it's really not about any particular technique. It's really more about approaching therapy as a process, again, of developing context sensitivity and functional coherence by any means. It's very dynamic. To me, therapy feels more and more like an improvisation process. It's not random. I don't know if you've ever tried improvisation, but you do need to learn principles. You cannot just go on stage and then hope for the best. Good improvisers, they have a lot of techniques and principles, but yeah, they also are able to go on stage and not know what's going to happen. They know where they are. They understand the process to go somewhere that's going to make sense, but they don't know what's going to happen next. And they're constantly throwing at each other a ball, and they say, all right, I want to go this way. Oh, you want to go that way? All right, we'll go that way. But you see, it's not disconnected. It's always a search for connection. That's the functional coherence aspect of it. Like let's try, just like improvisation, it's also very holistic. You cannot leave any detail or character out just because you want the story to go in a certain direction. The best improv plays are the ones where you feel like, wow, it's incredible. It must have been written. It's impossible. Look at how they're using every element of it. To me, a session, a therapy session, is like that. Sometimes it's not the session per se, it's the whole process. Sometimes you have a session that feels disconnected, feels like, what was that about? I don't understand. It's weird. But eventually it makes sense. Eventually it's integrated because you have this very integrative, holistic stance. Again, it relates to that sense of faith, like when people say, God has plans for you, it will make sense. It's kind of the same here. It's like, okay, I don't know yet what happened there. I don't understand where we're going, but I trust that if we continue to engage with the process of being aware of everything, knowing that it will never end, of course, there's always more to be aware of. So I don't mean it in a literal way, but more as a stance of openness to everything. And if I try to make sense of everything, again, knowing that it will never end, but it's engagements to trying to include and integrate everything. If I continue to care about that, then it will make sense, and it will also not make sense. That's why I was saying the connection with Rogers is interesting, because I think in the end his stance was being open, acceptance, being present, empathetic. And you see, we end up with the same conclusion. Now you could say, well, then why not use a humanistic approach, and what does RFT add to that? Well, first of all, perhaps. For me, what it adds personally in my work and what I bring in my trainings is a level of precision, if you want to. As I was saying, it's like you know how to program, you know how to go down to very, very subtle and micro elements of the process. I can do case conceptualization with a lot of precision, but I can also look at it from a much broader perspective. I can switch from different approaches in terms of techniques. I remain very coherent to my framework, but I can draw from techniques that come from completely outside of ACT, for example. So I don't know, it gives me a lot of flexibility and a lot of coherence at the same time. So I'd really have a hard time giving you an example, because if I give you an example, in the end, it's like, yeah, but it's anecdotal in a way, More important, I think, is that stance of integration and coherence. A lot of psychotherapy approaches define themselves as integrative, but they often think that they are the best ones at being integrative, which makes sense, right? You have your model, you think it's better. What I like about RFT, at least that's the way I present it, the way I understand it, is that it doesn't even think it's the best. It's more like, yeah, it could be something else. Because RFT, being a theory of language, helps you understand that RFT itself is language. And so even RFT itself is subject to this analysis and saying, we could be fused with RFT. You could be fused with the functional contextualism, the philosophy behind that. So if you don't apply it to that too, then you're already wrong. And to me, that's what I paradoxically find unique, or at least very useful. It's like it forces me to constantly also reflect on my own language, my own thinking, my own theory, and stay very open and very dynamic.
Yeah, beautiful. Meaning is always evolving, and there's moments of meaninglessness, and there's being able to integrate all of those aspects.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I'm struck by how so much of what you're saying, kind of like being aware of everything, even feels so much of like my meditation practice and like the teachings that I engage with. I guess it makes sense. I know a lot of ACT is like inspired by Buddhism, so there's kind of
there's
overlap.
Clearly a lot of connections. I read this summer a book by Arthur Dykman from 92 that was cited by Steve in 94. In 84, the paper I was mentioning earlier. It's called The Observer Self, and it's a mystic perspective on psychotherapy. And it's really interesting because as I was reading it, I was like, wow, there's pretty much everything of ACT in there. So you see that influenced Steve because he mentions it in his first RFT paper. But it's also a recognition that, and Steve said it many times, these ideas are really not new. If you're looking for something new, if you're trying to build something new, you're going to be disappointed eventually. You're going to realize, if you're honest, at least, when you realize that, yeah, it's not really new. So what's new? The newness is the way we express it, I guess. We have new words, we have new metaphors, we have new stories, and we're constantly sort of rebuilding it. And maybe that's necessary. If you read some very old texts from antique philosophers, for example, you'll find everything that it's in ACT. Now, arguably, the vehicle is not as effective as a self-help book written by a good writer today for people of today. Maybe not for everybody. For some people, they would prefer reading a philosopher's text or text from Buddhism, or there are different ways. But I think it makes sense. In many ways, you could say, well, that's because you were humans. In the end, if you are holistic enough in your approach to well-being, human well-being, you probably end up with the same principles, more or less. Again, there's nothing really fundamentally unique, and perhaps that's the most important to understand. When you understand that, you have both the humility and at the same time a lot of potential, because you realize, okay, well, then the good thing is that applies very widely. So lots of connection with Buddhism and a lot of philosophies and spiritual traditions. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I'd love to kind of open it up now to the Q&A session and see what's been bubbling up. I know we have a couple of questions in the chat box.
Oh yeah, I see that.
And I don't know if maybe Noah, you want to ask your question. Maybe you want to throw in a little bit there. I could also read the questions if you don't want to be on camera, so just let me know.
No, I can ask. I guess I thought about context sensitivity with dual awareness. I got recently trained in EMDR, and there's a lot of kind of dual awareness happening there. I mean, are they interchangeable concepts, or they're kind of more specific for different modalities?
Yeah, EMDR is a very interesting approach, because in some ways we could look at it as completely different and incompatible with an ACT approach, because there's this idea that you can change emotions or emotional responses. I'm not an expert in EMDR. I've done some EMDR as a client, actually, and explored it from a theoretical perspective. So my language might not be precise enough, but correct me if I'm wrong. But the way it's often been discussed in relationship to ACT was that, in some ways you could look at it as incompatible, because you're going to treat clients to reduce emotions, whereas ACT, it's going to be about accepting your emotions. Now, again, that's where I like my RFT language. I don't have to look at it that way. I can look at the process of integration, and then I realize that, well, it's a form of integration. When EMDR, in fact, it's one of the key terms, I think, integration, at least in the process, there is a phase of integration. You could look at it as a way of connecting with experiences that are usually avoided. Like one of the interpretations of how EMDR works is that because you're focused on the dual task, you're not able to elaborate as much language. I know there are different theories, but that's one that I find particularly compelling, at least from an RFT perspective. You're invited to connect with your physical sensation at the same time as you remember, say, a traumatic event or something very activating. And while usually you would get into a whole elaboration of the story, perhaps rumination, and instead you're sort of forced, or at least you're you are encouraged, let's say, to stay in touch with the part of your experience that you usually don't connect with. It's really, even etymologically, it's interesting to think of it as repairing, repairing, reconnecting part of your experiences that are not connected. So you stay focused on that. And again, I would say Carl Rogers' approach is very similar. He reflects back to clients things that seem to be in contradiction or disconnected or ambivalent. And he helps the client stay focused on that with compassion and acceptance. I would say EMDR approach is pretty similar in the end. You have to build a sort of safe place or a stable process that helps you go into the difficult experience. You'll be able to stay with it. And then you stay with it long enough to create this connection again. And then you are repaired, not as a machine, but as a reintegrated. You're healed again. Etymologically, healing is the same idea. It's the idea that things that were not together are together again, and vice versa too. Things that were fused are differentiated, not disconnected, not eliminated, but differentiated. You're here now. The trauma was there then. So you can differentiate here now from there then, but you can also connect it. You can also look at there then from here now. I would say, if you look at it from an RFT perspective, I don't see any fundamental incompatibility between EMDR and ACT. I could say it's different ways of doing something relatively similar, especially when it comes to fusion, diffusion, acceptance, and avoidance. I don't know if there is an explicit component of values in EMDR at this point. I don't think so, but implicitly it leads people to be more whole. And so in some ways, it's a form of values and self as context. But you see, in behavioral activation and in the dialectical behavioral therapy, at some point they did add a component of values explicitly that, and I think it was influenced by ACT or maybe influenced by something larger than that. But in behavioral activation, for example, they recognize that, motivating people to change their behavior is good, but perhaps if it could be toward meaningful actions, there is more clear sense of values would be good. And so they added that component. I don't know if it's the case currently or in some ways, but I could totally see MDR having a component like that. That's in somewhere in the model. But again, that would probably mean that in the end, all psychotherapy approaches are kind of the same. Not in the technical level. I think there are differences, but deeper at the process level, I think they all try to do something relatively similar.
Yeah, the same in the goal, trying to reduce suffering.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. It depends on how you define suffering, of course. To me, it's suffering. It's a lack of connection in the end. Don't want to oversimplify it, but I think really my goal is to help clients have a meaningful life, and by that I mean connect their experience to their whole experience. The suffering comes from a disconnect. Even when it's fusion, you could say, well, it's because there's too much connection, but it's because there's a lack of connection with other things. It's not that you're too connected with anything, it's that you're not connected enough to other things, really more the issue, in my opinion. So it's one way of looking at it, of course, but I find it pretty pragmatic. I see there are a bunch of questions. You want to go over them? Yeah. I let you drive it, Artem.
Yeah. So I see there's the next question. I think it was from Rachel. Do you want to unmute and ask the question?
Interested in what you were saying, that just having this relational frame theory allows you to feel like to have greater precision in how you're thinking about meeting a client, and also just the idea of like, okay, so I'm in here and it's an improvisation, but I kind of have skills to be able to be responsive. And so maybe it's not possible, but I was just wondering if you could even give us a really short, like, so here's the client and like, here's how I might use what I have. Like, you know, I was really thinking about like one or two particular clients of mine who like, we understand maybe where they came from, why they have ambivalence, but they just kind of keep getting knocked down in the world from probably things that like they can't quite confusion about like how to interpret. So I'm just wondering if you could give even a short
I think
thing.
so. Yeah. And I think you asked the question about case conceptualization, right? You didn't say the word in when you were speaking, but I saw what you posted. Yeah. So I think for me, case conceptualization is really an ongoing process. I don't use case conceptualization as a first step before doing an intervention. I'm not saying it's wrong to do it this way, but the problem is that it tends to create a conceptualization precisely of the client that's pretty sequential and linear, when you can have the right picture and then you know what to do and then you're going to measure the outcome. In a process-based approach, to me, it's something that needs to happen as an ongoing basis. Well, the cool thing, though, is that case conceptualization is an intervention already. So for example, if I want to assess context sensitivity in a client, because like I said, it's a process that I want to develop in clients. I want to help the client develop context sensitivity and functional coherence. So of course I can do a case conceptualization of the client based on those two processes. What is the level of context sensitivity of the client at the beginning of a intervention? Okay, well, let's look at the context. What do I include in the context? Potentially everything. I can organize it in ways that are practical. There are different ways. One can be the biopsychosocial model, for example. So are they aware of their biological aspect of their experience? Are they aware of their psychological aspect of their experience, the social aspect of their experience? And you could add other layers to it. You could organize the context based on another system, self, other, and then higher power. That's the way we tend to define spirituality. There are lots of ways: past, present, future. In the end, what you want is an organization of the context that's holistic, and then explore those different aspects. And how is the client aware of those different aspects? Do you have clients who are very reflective, for example? They open and they can talk a lot about what's going on in their lives, but they almost never talk about their emotions. And if you ask them about their emotions, it seems very flat. Yeah, that's very common, right? Or physical sensations. They really have a hard time observing, describing that. So then I would count that in my case conceptualization in a way it's a little more formal. I would say, all right, that's an area where they seem to lack sensitivity. Or they're aware of it, but they tend to avoid it, or they will tend to respond to it in a very rigid way. It could also be very attached to feeling great, feeling intense, feeling excited. So the sensitivity is, again, it's not so much the problem is not that that they're necessarily too sensitive to it, is what they're not sensitive to. So that's something you can do relatively formally. You can use, of course, the behavioral framework, antecedent, behavior, consequence. You know, how sensitive is the client to antecedents of their behaviors, of their own behaviors, of the consequences, long-term consequences in different domains. So really, in the end, it's like, okay, how do you like to organize the context, and what is missing in the client's sensitivity? You can do it relatively formally. You could use even questionnaires. You can use measures of mindfulness. They work pretty well in that context. Or you can do it in a less formal way by interacting with the client and pay attention to what seems to be either missed or it comes over time, you know, you all have experience and you know what it's like. Sometimes you have an idea of how your client is functioning, and then over time it is a transformation, perhaps because of the therapeutic process, but perhaps also because of what you start to understand better. And then in terms of functional coherence, what I pay attention to in particular is this ability of integrating right? Are they more like compartmentalizing their lives? Like, like a client who looks at their life as chapters in a book, and there's this and that and that and that and that. It's pretty linear. I moved on to the next thing and I don't want to talk about what happened before. Or more reflective, more circular, more dynamic. They integrate the past, or they get stuck in the past. Or it could be about different aspects of their current experiences. Like, how can I feel anxious when I'm so happy? I don't understand. That doesn't make sense. Or so I pay attention to that. How they basically connect the dots. In terms of case conceptualization and marker of progress, what I want to see is that it's more and more integrated, but it remains dynamic. It's not integrated in a fixed way, now I know who I am, I know I get it, and it's going to be fixed like that. More like, yeah, I'm able to observe changes in my life. I'm able to make sense, but I'm also okay with things changing. And there is something that continues to be true. I'm feeling pretty comfortable in this changing experience because there is something that continues to be true. So you sense it through the way the client is in interaction with you. They are more perhaps open to go to places that they didn't want to consider before. They just like in it's something pretty common also in dialectical behavior therapy because it's something that's targeted very very specifically the ability of the dialectic way of thinking. Can you consider one thought and its opposite, a position and its opposite, and integrate both? They can both be true in some ways. That is really a good marker of progress in terms of functional coherence. And of course, the pragmatic dimension is the client able to pay attention to the consequences of their actions, to compare it to their goals, or are they stuck with the sense of what's right, wrong in an intrinsic way? Are they very essentialist about what's true, or are they able to approach truth as something that's more dynamic and changing and yet consistent? There are elements you can express pretty explicitly and formally to build a case conceptualization and have and monitor progress, and yet you remain very open and process based. So again, that's what I like about RFT. It helps you do your work in a way that can be very open, very conversational, and at the same time, if you want to be more precise and specific, and it's important if you want to be accountable and not just say, life is a process and we don't know where it will go. And this is appealing too, of course. In some ways it's true, but what is also true is that it's a job, you're paid for it, people want to make progress, and that needs to be taken into account. The whole thing again, yeah.
It's hugely helpful, really.
Thanks, Richard.
Does anybody else have questions? I see we have one from Tamara. I want to leave that one for a little bit later. Is there anybody else that has any other questions that you could either put them in the chat box or you could
questions about what's next in the books, papers. One thing I can refer is my website, languageasintervention.com. There are lots of free resources there, so I feel very comfortable promoting it because you find material there, video demonstrations and resources. In terms of book and papers references, it's not really up to date, but it's you'll find a number of books there. There are lots of good books to read. I would recommend in particular the books by Niklas Stornecki. Write it here. Because he wrote a bunch of books, RFT books for clinicians. His more recent one is on functional analysis. He wrote a book on metaphors also, and one that's called also Learning RFT. So that's definitely something I would recommend to check out. There are some books on the self from an RFT perspective. In terms of trainings, there are a bunch of trainings you can find. I provide trainings. You find trainings from a team in Ireland, Barnes Holmes, or who else is training RFT? Well, Niklas Stornecki is training in there. There are people in Spain too. More broadly, if you train in ACT, you'll be trained in something that's compatible with RFT. But depending on who you are training with, the language of RFT will be more or less present and explicit. So, for example, you can learn values from an ACT perspective by exploring a list of values and helping clients be more aware of what matters to them. You'll do some exercises and things like that. From an RFT perspective, you'll get a level of precision that's different. You look at values as intrinsic, overarching, positive sources of reinforcement. You'll learn different forms of framing to connect clients to their values. It's cool. It's compatible. You can learn first with precision and then techniques that are broader, or vice versa. I don't think it matters that much. What's next? It depends on how far you want to go in your learning. Also, I used to be very, I guess, perhaps perfectionistic even in my work with clients. Perhaps like a lot of young practitioners, you see all the problems that could be resolved, and it's like you could do better, you could do even better, and then with time and age, you realize, no, actually, perhaps getting better is learning to stop trying to get better, and maybe that's the true acceptance. So now I'm less like into I should be, you should learn this and that. More like go where you feel like going. If there's something you find interesting, go ahead. The cool thing with RFT is that you probably learn something about RFT. Like I'll give you an example of something that's pretty popular right now, like IFS, if you're familiar, internal family system. I'm now old enough experience to realize that every 2 years there is a new thing, a big thing that everybody needs to learn. And perhaps also it's more exacerbated in our times because of the way we communicate and learn, and everything goes fast, perhaps too. I don't say that to dismiss it, because I could apply it to ACT too and to all models. And like I said earlier, there's something good about that. I think we look at things from different perspectives, and every time we learn something new. IFS brings a perspective that ACT doesn't. It's in there. It's in surface context in a way, but not everything. Just like CFT, compassion-focused therapy, brought something that, yeah, you could say it's in ACT, but you could also say it's much more explicit in CFT, and so on. So, in a way, I would say, yeah, if you, for some reason, because of where you are at in your life, in your work, what you notice in your clients, you feel like you could really use some training in motivation interviewing, or in a more relational-based therapy, and go ahead and do that. And progressively, you'll probably have a sense of the whole functioning. We all have enough a background when coming out of school, of course, in some ways. But then it's an ongoing process of, like I said earlier, it's like, what's missing? Where do I feel like there is something I don't understand, or something that's going on in society that is impacting my clients, and I need to understand that better, and then we keep moving. What I would recommend, though, is to not stay stuck and rigidly attached to anything in particular. So every time I hear that's the model, that's that, all you need is to be aware of your physical sensations, or all you need is to do this particular procedure, and I'm always like, yeah, until it's not gonna be true anymore, because perhaps the placebo effect starts to wear off, and what is still real about it will continue to be true. But it's like the use of psychedelics, another thing that's very trendy right now. There's a lot of interesting things in it, and like I did with the EMDR, I think we could look at the process from an RFT ACT perspective and say, yeah, of course, it makes sense. In fact, there are some ACT researchers who are very interested in the use of psychedelics. But I don't think it's gonna be the one thing. I think it's, again, eventually we'll move on to something else. That doesn't mean everything is the same, or no. It's more like, well, yeah, it's it's a transformation of the same process. There's an expression of the same process that's different over time. Just like your clients, they change, they evolve. But in some ways, they continue to be people who care about their values, they have emotions, and we need to not get stuck with any particular content. Yeah, help really appreciate the process. That's how I would say about the what's next, other books and things. In some ways, it's really more an attitude of exploration and integration of what you can learn.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I've shouted your book out many times, but I think Mastering the Clinical Conversation is definitely, like, I recommend it for everybody. Like, I'm not even a clinician, but I'm very interested in psychology and language. So just like go reading that book, it was just like very like expansive for understanding how language works, how it works in my own mind, how it works in relationships, and obviously in the clinical aspect.
It's cool to hear. It's 10 years old now, and I still like it. I think when sometimes I go back to it and thinking, what would I do differently? Not so much, but it's interesting because I think that I understand better now. Even things that I wrote literally, I had co-authors, so it could make sense. There are things that I didn't understand as well as my co-authors when it's things that they wrote, but there are things that I wrote, and I'm like, I think I understand it now. So does that mean like I didn't know what I was talking about? No, I think again, it's that we keep evolving with the process, like remember the first time or you heard or said, I love you, if you had good childhood, it was when you were a kid, or maybe later, I don't know. But now you look years later, depending on how old you are, but it could be decades later. Does it mean the same thing? Not exactly, right? There's so much history. You have good, bad experiences, painful experiences, meaningful experiences. You heard stories, and yet it's the same words. And if you were to explain what's different about it, it's not easy. But the whole function that has transformed. So I feel like that when I go back to the book, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. Literally, I was talking about transcendent sources of reinforcement, and then I know I knew what I was talking about. I know I was not just like writing something. I know it was not a time of ChatGPT and things like that, so it was not so easy actually to just copy and paste and things like that. But I really feel like I understand it much better now. So that doesn't mean you cannot write more and there's not more. Again, you should just stick with this book, of course. But for me personally, I don't necessarily feel the need to write more, to do more. I feel more like I can continue to explore what's in there. I think it has a lot to do with this functional contextual philosophy. Because what I'm saying about our book is true of, say, for example, the first ACT book, which is what, 30 years, 25, 26 years old now. And I'm speaking about the first edition. I don't think there's anything that's really outdated. When you take a functional contextual approach, nothing is really outdated. It's not about any particular technique, topographically defined. It's like you said, the connection with Buddhism, it's a connection with antique philosophy. So if you pay attention to the function, there's always something new to rediscover and to understand. Again, to me, that is very much the process of therapy with clients. Like we can revisit things that we've talked about before. I often ask questions to clients that I've asked them before. And often I'll acknowledge it just in case they think that I'm not listening, but I think after a while they know that it's not the issue. It's more like, let's revisit it again. Because the perspective may have changed, and it's also not so much about learning something new in terms of content, it's about the process of taking perspective again.
Yeah, beautiful. So does anybody else have any questions? We have about 15 minutes left, so if you do have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. Just give you a minute if anybody has anything. Yeah, I was just, I don't see anything coming in, but is there anything else that feels important for you to mention, Matt? Is there anything that we didn't explore?
Well, let me think. There is there's I could go off on different topics that I'm passionate about.
For sure.
Mentioned earlier the topic of spirituality. There's a process that I've always been really passionate about. When I got into ACT, perhaps you remember the first edition of the ACT book, if you ever had it in your hands. It's not published anymore. You can find it, but it's only the second edition that's printed now. So the subtitle was An Experiential Approach to Behavior Change. This whole idea of being experiential, I think, is a really a key aspect of ACT that can be misunderstood. I didn't even completely understand it at that time when I was learning ACT. I was in France, reading books in English with my English was not as good, and not being trained directly by authors, it can be hard sometimes to understand what people mean. I think it's an aspect that's really important, but that can be misunderstood because there is a sort of a presentation of ACT that sometimes is seen as something a little esoteric. It was even sometimes accused of being too cult-like. You go to an experiential workshop and you're going to have big emotions, and then you come home and you're like, wow, my life changed, and I want to change the world. Because especially if you're doing a training with someone like Steve Hayes, who's very engaged in his work and promoting his work, you can be inspired certainly by him and people like him, who says that there's something we can do about ecology, about peace in the world, and things like that. And it's we work in a field. I'm guessing you come from different fields, but all more or less in the psychology, counseling world, and all. Where by definition we can touch on everything. That's perhaps one of the reasons why I ended up choosing psychology. I was interested in psychology without a very specific professional project in mind at first, but I think retrospectively, what made me stick with it is that if you're interested in a lot of things, psychology is a really good field because you can talk about everything in the end. Everything involves the human behavior in some ways. Even if you study biology or geology, it's still the behavior of studying geology and biology. History, of course, you study human behavior, historical figures, and so on. So there is a potential, of course, to touch on a lot of things and big things. But to me, it's always been important to remain, I guess, grounded, we could say, and not use that power too much, or not. It's not. The idea of being experiential, to me, it relates to that context sensitivity. You want to be grounded in experience. And I'm always paying attention to that when I work with clients. I'm always helping the client be in touch with their own experience. I don't want to help clients move in a particular direction. That's why I was saying earlier, I'm careful with the focus on goals, helping clients do this and that. I see sometimes in ACT too much focus, or perhaps we have too much focus on changing the client's behavior, trying to so that we can have tangible ways of measuring progress. But with a bit of distance now on the whole approach, I feel like sometimes we might force things a little too much, and that's something I also wonder about EMDR, about psychedelic therapies, about all those approaches that they're often presented as quick, spectacular. People change radically, completely. And again, perhaps it's a reflection of our time when we like things to go fast and really work well. It's not wrong. It's probably just the transformation of our societies in general. We want things to go always faster, more efficient, more effective. It's cannot say that it's wrong per se, but I'm always concerned about the superficiality of that, which is interesting because when I was a student in France, the dominant model there is psychoanalysis, and I didn't like psychoanalysis because I thought that was not scientifically based enough. And I liked CBT because it was concrete. You could measure outcomes, goals, interventions, and so on. And now, 20 years later, I feel almost like I've switched position to criticizing approaches that are evidence-based, measure outcomes, look, it works better. And I'm like, I end up saying similar things that I used to hear my psychoanalysis teachers say that, well, things are more complex than that. You cannot measure humans the way you measure machines. And they used to criticize CBT for just changing symptoms, but not the underlying issue. And I'm like, oh, I'm kind of saying the same thing. Again, I think it's an integration of the whole. It's like, well, there is some truth, and maybe I realize that now. That doesn't mean we should reject any outcome-based approach or consider that everything that works fast is just superficial. But that's a reflection I have more and more. Personally, in my work, I'm thinking, well, in the end, really what I want is for my client to be to develop autonomy, or you could frame it with the theory of attachment. In the end, I want to help my clients to be more securely attached. And I would even expand that. I could see my value as a person in the world to help other people and myself have secure attachment. It's just another way of saying psychological flexibility in act in the end. What I mean is being autonomous and connected. So everything I do in my work that I feel I can promote that with clients, to me is good and right. So I like this posture because I feel like it's not so much about act, it's not so much about changing a concrete behavior, it's really more about an attitude. I find that pretty liberating. I don't know if it's something that, again, I said I was pretty influenced by Carl Rogers this past few years, but I don't know if that's something we hear enough nowadays. Perhaps it is, I'm not hearing it. I feel like there's a lot of focus on change of behavior, radical, fast. Again, it's very spectacular. And perhaps underneath that, there is the same desire to feel whole and connected and all. So I'm not really worried about that, like we're going in the wrong direction. It's not what I mean. I mean more like, all right, let's not forget that that dimension of our work. And I'm sure I'm not the only one thinking this, and I'm not very interested nowadays in changing the world or preaching, and that part of it was more exciting at the beginning of my career. I think it's pretty typical when you start. It's pretty healthy too, But to want to change things, it's not like I don't want to change things, but I think I'm more I'm more aware that when you focus on yourself, or with one client that you have an impact on the world that's actually pretty big, in some ways. So I'm going all over the place right now because you just gave me the open mic, but feel free to.
Yeah. No, I feel like what you're talking about, you were saying that I don't know if there's a lot of this happening, but it's in the modality I was trained, the coaching modality I was trained, one of the pieces is basically there's a self-improvement paradigm. Right. Yeah. That's the paradigm you see in a lot of psychotherapeutic methods and in a lot of coaching methods.
Yeah.
Basically, the creator of this method that I was trained in, Steve March, he says shifting to a self-unfolding paradigm, yeah. Right? Where you're dropping the change agenda and you're asking the radical question of what if nothing is missing? Yeah. Right. And so there isn't that kind of needing to push things because people can feel that. And it's just kind of interesting, kind of your journey, like, going from, oh, I need everything to be science-based, I need everything to be measured, very precise, to like, okay, there's this ambiguity and subjectivity and actually openness in the human experience, and like allowing it to unfold and allowing it to be open. So I think that's beautiful. And there was one more question, maybe Amanda. You said that maybe he answered it, but I don't know. Maybe you could just ask it, and maybe something else will come up for Matt.
Thank you. So my question was around letting go of goals and dropping goals, and feeling like I think similarly, however, there is pressure with how clients sometimes arrive to therapy, or how what certain practices or insurance companies want you to deliver when it comes to clients achieving certain outcomes. And I was wondering how you so the original question was, how do you balance that pressure of clients are seeing that they are healing and progress? And what do you see your therapeutic role in relation to those desires that people bring with them to therapy? And maybe a follow-up on that is, would you say that your role then is less to ensure that people achieve X, Y, or Z goal, and more to sit with that desire itself and start stretching that?
Yeah. Yes, and there's perhaps more I can say. The cool thing about taking a true integrative stance is they really don't have to fight anything in the end. Again, I refer to the improvisation process, where you never have to eliminate something that your partner said. You need to build on what they said. Now, in order for that to work, you have to really believe it. And to believe it, you have to experience it and see that it works. It really works to work toward expansion. Like I said, it's always a matter of lack of connection. If someone has a strong goal and they're very specifically attached to their goal, and they want to reach that goal, and they keep going back to, I want this goal, I'm not going to fight that. Sometimes I might be tempted to try to explain that maybe that's having more flexibility. But usually, if the person is pretty open, it works. But precisely, if they're very attached to their goal, they're not very open, at least about that. So it's not usually a very good approach to try to explain to them or convince them that they could be more flexible. Instead, say, yeah, all right, no problem. Of course, that seems to be something very important. Let's expand that so that we connect to what's important. What's really a key is to connect, in the end, everything you experience to what's meaningful. And you can do that with goals that people are very attached to, but you can do it with anything that people experience. What is meaningful about that? In fact, it's an exercise that I like to do often in training or in session. It's like, you take anything that the client wants to experience or to explore, and you explore what's meaningful about it. Even things that seem to be trivial at first, you'll find eventually that it connects to your whole life. There is something important about everything. That is the process of developing values, of valuing, really. When you find your values in everything, then they're also in your goals, and you can still reach goals. But they don't have that same, I guess we could say, not as much intensity, because you'll find your values in other places too. So, for example, when clients experience dilemma, they are ambivalent about choices in their lives, one thing that I really like to do is to emphasize with them, to help them connect with their values, regardless of the choice that they're going to make. If you think of your choice in terms of values in this direction or away from my values in another direction, you create a conditionality with your values that goes against the very concept of values. Values are transcendence, so you connect with your values no matter what. You are connecting with your values now if you want to. I often ask my clients, how do you want to be in this moment of ambivalence? Like, how do you want to approach that from a perspective of your values? Like even if you don't know what you're going to do, if you're struggling to make a choice, what is a way of approaching this dilemma that makes you feel good about yourself, that you like being like that? It's often an eye-opener. You realize that, oh, actually, I can live my values right now. there are things that I can reach by choosing option A or B. Should I move to another city or stick with my job? Of course, that is going to lead to different outcomes. But I'm very radical about this now. And I say now because I understand it better. It's not going to make any difference in terms of values. You connect to your values no matter what. We could say, well, but there are ways that are more important than others to express your values. I value exploration, exploring the world. It's better to travel to another country than staying at home. And I would say from a values perspective, no. From a meaning perspective, no. It doesn't make any difference. And that's really important, I think, to develop this idea. When it's very clear, I don't have to fight the clients being attached to their goals. What I want is to help them connect this goal to their values. Usually what happens is that when people connect to what's important at the values level, the paradox is that you could think that it's going to make them even more intensely attached to their goals, but it's the opposite that happens. It's like the process of validation in DBT. You could think that validating an emotion is going to make people even more dysregulated. In fact, it's the opposite that happens. Again, I think it's because of the connection effect. When you feel connected, you feel more at peace. You feel more in the present. You don't have to go somewhere else. You can, but it's not necessary. You realize you live your life now. You have your values, and yeah, it would be nice to reach this goal, but it's not as critical. Now, I'm not going to tell you it's easy, that everybody takes it easily. I'm not going to tell you that institutions understand that language easily. I worked in institutions. Now I'm completely independent, and I definitely appreciate being able to use the language that I want to create a framework for my work. I worked in institutions, in universities, and I could feel that tension, like you have to define your work, your objectives. Are you going to assess the progress of students? Students want to know and there's more and more pressure like that. At least I feel like it was the case in academia in comparison to when I started. And that's partly why I left, because I felt like I was having a hard time integrating that what I was developing more and more from my own philosophy and what was expected from me. That being said, it was possible. I didn't have to live. To me, it's very important to stay consistent and honest with that. You can always make it work no matter what. I supervise a number of therapists who have to take notes and write their reports in ways that are consistent with the DSM and categories and things that might be at odds with the functional contextual philosophy. But there are always ways to find a language and to be honest, I'm not saying like you find a language and people are going to think you do this, but in fact you do that. No, it's just explaining. And usually it helps you better understand what you do. I'll finish with this example. I attended a workshop by Mike Tuhig, who's an ACT expert on OCD years ago, and it was very interesting. He showed us a demonstration by a CBT therapist, a very, very good expert in OCD, doing exposure. And so during the whole session, it was about measuring the decrease of anxiety, right? Typical exposure to stimulus and decrease of anxiety. So where is your anxiety at? Okay, decreases. Okay. The goal clearly was to decrease anxiety. And then Mike did his demonstration, and before he started the exposure session, because it was also exposure, his very first question was, can you tell me again why it's important to you to be able to touch this thing and not wash your hands? So there was already a framework based on values. The exposure session was framed in the context of connecting with meaning. And then during the session, he would ask also what the level of anxiety, what the client was experiencing. But what's interesting is that every time she would notice something, he would say, great, anxiety would go up, great. Anxiety would go down, great. Because what he was reinforcing was the ability to notice anxiety and to stay engaged. I cite this example because I think it shows how you can, you don't have to remove anything really in the end. It's more about expanding the meaning around the procedure. I cannot really think of anything that I would not do from, like, it's only when it's like unethical, but usually we all agree on that. It makes sense. It's still functional. It's not arbitrary usually. Ethical things where we can all agree on, usually we're like, yeah, because that would cause this kind of problem. Yeah. Other than that, it's a matter of techniques and language. But if you expand what people want to connect to values, what they deeply want, usually we find a common ground. And again, I'm not saying it's easy. That's often the core of the process, to be able to help the clients approach their life from that perspective. It can take a very long time, of course. But I'm not worried per se. To me, it's not a prerequisite. It's not like if they want this outcome, I cannot help them because that's not how I work. Like, no, of course, everybody starts with that anyways. I still want outcomes, but I work on it. When I'm too attached to my outcomes, I'm trying to reflect on that and notice that. So I'm not worried about that per se. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matthieu. Appreciate this session and just really your integrative approach. It feels very expansive, and I think that's a great view to hold, with therapy and just life in general. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for coming on, and thank you everybody else who joined today and asked questions and participated. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.